In this episode, we shift the spotlight from devices and configurations to the identities that actually touch those systems. Because in modern environments, almost every meaningful action is performed through an account that either represents a person or represents a process. When you are new to cybersecurity, it is easy to think of accounts as simple logins, but the Center for Internet Security, CIS, controls V8 treat account management as a core safety mechanism because identity is where power is granted, tracked, and sometimes abused. If you can clearly explain different account types and how they are created, changed, and removed, you can often predict where risk will appear before an incident ever happens. This topic matters because attackers do not need to break down a door if they can borrow a key, copy a key, or find a key that nobody remembered to take back. By the end, you should have a clear mental picture of the major account categories and the lifecycle discipline that keeps them under control. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to understand that accounts exist for different purposes, and those purposes determine both the level of risk and the type of oversight required. Some accounts are meant for everyday human work like reading email, accessing applications, and saving files, while other accounts exist specifically to change systems and manage other identities. Still others exist for automation, where software performs tasks without a human sitting at a keyboard. The danger comes when we treat all these account types as if they are interchangeable, because the controls you need for a high-privilege account are not the same as the controls you need for a basic user account. When environments grow over time, organizations often accumulate accounts organically, and the original reasoning behind an account's creation can get lost. Clarifying account types restores that reasoning and gives you a way to decide what should exist, what should be restricted, and what should be removed. User accounts are the most familiar category, and they are intended to represent one specific person who needs access to perform their job. The long-term security value of a user account is not that it lets someone log in, but that it creates traceability, meaning actions can be linked back to an individual for troubleshooting, accountability, and investigation. When user accounts are uniquely assigned and consistently managed, it becomes much easier to answer basic questions like who accessed a sensitive system, who changed a setting, or who downloaded data. A beginner mistake is assuming that user accounts should be granted broad access by default, just in case the person needs it later. A healthier model is that user accounts begin with the minimum access needed for the job and expand only when a clear business need exists, because every extra permission is another opportunity for misuse or compromise. Administrative accounts are different because they exist to change the environment, not merely use it, and that difference should immediately raise your security instincts. These accounts can install software, modify configurations, create other accounts, reset credentials, and access protected system areas that normal users should never touch. When an administrative account is compromised, the attacker often gains the ability to disable defenses, create backdoor access, and move quickly across systems. That is why good governance separates administrative activity from everyday activity instead of letting one login do everything. If you browse the web, open attachments, and do routine tasks with the same account that can reconfigure servers, you are mixing high-risk exposure with high-impact privilege. Strong programs treat administrative accounts as special tools that are used intentionally, briefly, and with visibility, rather than as a default identity that follows someone everywhere. One concept that ties user and administrative accounts together is role clarity, because roles are the practical bridge between job responsibilities and access decisions. A role is not a title on an org chart. It is a description of what tasks someone must be able to perform and what systems those tasks require. If roles are vague, account privileges become vague, and vague privileges tend to expand over time because nobody wants to be the person who blocks work. Role clarity helps prevent privilege creep, which is the slow accumulation of access as people change projects, inherit tasks, or request one-off permissions that never get removed. Privilege creep is especially dangerous because it looks harmless day to day while quietly increasing the blast radius of a compromise. When you can explain how a role maps to access and how access is reviewed as roles change, you are speaking the language of disciplined account governance. Service accounts add complexity because they represent software and automation rather than a human being, yet they still authenticate and still hold permissions that can be abused. These accounts might run scheduled jobs, connect applications to databases, move files between systems, or support background services that keep business processes running. The risk is that service accounts are often long-lived, rarely reviewed, and sometimes granted broad permissions because it seems easier than troubleshooting a restrictive setup. If a service account credential is exposed, an attacker can use it quietly, and the activity may not look like a person's login pattern, which can delay detection. Good governance requires that service accounts have a documented purpose, a clearly assigned owner, and permissions limited to exactly what the service needs. If you ever hear that nobody knows what a service account does, but they are afraid to disable it, you are seeing the exact failure that lifecycle discipline is meant to prevent. Shared accounts are a common source of confusion because they can feel convenient while silently destroying accountability. A shared account is one set of credentials used by multiple people, which means the organization loses the ability to reliably attribute actions to a single individual. When something goes wrong, investigations become slower, and the honest people who did nothing wrong can still become suspects because the identity is ambiguous. Shared accounts also make offboarding harder because you cannot simply disable one person's access when they leave if many people still rely on that same login. In some environments, shared accounts exist due to legacy systems or operational habits, but the governance goal is usually to eliminate them or strictly reduce their use. When they cannot be eliminated immediately, the most important principle is to wrap them in compensating oversight so that use is controlled, tracked, and reviewed rather than informal and invisible. Temporary accounts are another category that sounds simple but causes long-term trouble when governance is weak, because temporary often becomes permanent by accident. These accounts might be created for contractors, interns, incident response activities, special projects, or short bursts of administrative work. The defining feature is that they exist for a limited purpose and a limited time, which means they should have a planned end date from the moment they are created. The risk is that people remember to create access when they need it and forget to remove access when the need ends, especially when the person who requested the account is no longer paying attention. Temporary accounts should be treated as planned risk with guardrails, including clear approvals, scope permissions, and expiration that forces review before the account can continue. If you can explain why temporary accounts require stronger discipline than normal accounts, you are thinking like a controls-focused practitioner. Now let's connect account types to the idea of a life cycle, because lifecycle management is the discipline that keeps identity from becoming cluttered and dangerous over time. A life cycle is the story of an account from birth to retirement, including creation, use, change, review, and deactivation. The reason this matters is that the highest risk account is often not the newest one, but the forgotten one, the abandoned one, or the one that still has privileges it no longer needs. Lifecycle thinking forces you to ask when an account should exist, what conditions must remain true for it to keep existing, and what triggers removal. It also helps you build reliable processes that survive employee turnover and organizational change. When lifecycle management is healthy, accounts are not mysterious artifacts. They are managed resources with defined purpose and controlled duration. Provisioning is the creation phase, and it is where many organizations accidentally bake in long-term risk through rushed decisions. Provisioning should begin with a clear request, an approval that matches business authority, and a role fit that determines what access is necessary. A beginner misconception is that speed is the only provisioning success factor, but speed without correctness creates access that is hard to unwind later. Good provisioning also ensures uniqueness for user accounts so that one identity maps to one person, and it ensures documentation for non-human accounts so that someone can explain why the account exists. Provisioning is also the best time to apply consistent naming and categorization, because if you cannot tell what an account is by how it is labeled and tracked, governance becomes slower and mistakes become more likely. A well-run provisioning process is not just a gate. It is the foundation of clarity. The change phase of the life cycle is where privilege creep usually happens, because access tends to increase in small increments while rarely decreasing. People change roles, take on new tasks, support a project for a few months, and then move on, but their permissions often remain. A disciplined life cycle includes triggers that cause access to be reevaluated, such as job changes, department changes, or increased privilege requests. The goal is not to make work hard, but to keep permissions aligned with current reality rather than historical convenience. This is also where administrative accounts require special attention, because adding administrative capability should not feel like adding an app to a phone. It should feel like granting authority to change the environment. When you see a scenario where someone has far more access than they need, the root cause is often weak lifecycle change control rather than a single bad decision. Review is the phase that proves the lifecycle is functioning, because reviews force the organization to look at accounts as they exist today and decide whether they still make sense. Reviews can focus on different questions depending on the account type, such as whether a user still needs a system, whether a service account is still used, whether administrative access is still justified, or whether a temporary account should have expired already. The value of review is that it catches quiet failures that daily operations will not notice, especially dormant accounts that still exist and still hold privileges. Reviews also create accountability, because someone must attest that access remains appropriate or take action to change it. When you can explain why periodic reviews matter, even when nothing appears broken, you are describing the difference between reactive security and controlled security. Deprovisioning is the removal phase, and it is one of the most important safety mechanisms because it reduces the number of valid keys that exist in the environment. When someone leaves the organization or changes roles, their access should be adjusted quickly so that old privileges do not linger. Dormant accounts are particularly dangerous because they may not trigger attention through normal use, yet attackers love accounts that no one watches. Deprovisioning is also critical for temporary and shared accounts, because those identities can quietly outlive their original purpose. The safest deprovisioning processes are tied to authoritative business events like termination, contract end dates, and project completion rather than relying on someone to remember. If you can describe deprovisioning as a controlled, auditable process rather than a last-minute cleanup task, you are aligned with the controls mindset. Ownership and accountability tie the entire identity picture together, because an account with no owner is an account that will eventually become a risk. User accounts can be associated with an individual and their manager, but service accounts require explicit business ownership because the software itself cannot be held accountable. Administrative accounts require ownership with strong oversight because their impact is so high. Shared and temporary accounts require ownership because exceptions and special cases are exactly where governance can decay. Ownership is not just a name on a document. It is the expectation that someone will respond when reviews show problems, when metrics trend in the wrong direction, or when exceptions need renewal. When organizations struggle with identity, it is often because responsibility is spread so thin that nobody feels compelled to act. Clear ownership is the simplest antidote to that drift. Metrics and evidence help you prove that lifecycle discipline is more than good intentions, because they translate identity governance into measurable health signals. Examples of useful measures include how quickly accounts are disabled after termination events, how many dormant accounts exist, how many accounts have elevated privileges, and how often service accounts go unreviewed beyond a defined period. The exact numbers matter less than the ability to show trends and to connect trends to corrective action. Evidence also supports audit readiness because it demonstrates that account processes are consistent and repeatable. When metrics show a gap, the organization can respond by improving workflows, clarifying role definitions, or tightening approvals rather than simply accepting the risk. This is how lifecycle governance becomes a living system. Observe, measure, correct, and then measure again to confirm improvement. To conclude, clarifying account types and life cycles gives you a practical framework for understanding identity risk and for building controls that survive constant organizational change. User accounts should preserve individual accountability. Administrative accounts must be separated and tightly governed. Service accounts need clear ownership and minimal permissions, Shared accounts undermine traceability and should be reduced or controlled, and temporary accounts must expire by design rather than by memory. Lifecycle discipline connects creation, change, review, and removal into a process you can measure and defend with evidence. When you can explain these relationships clearly, you are ready for exam questions that test not only definitions, but also the reasoning that makes identity governance effective. More importantly, you will start to see identity as the set of keys to the enterprise, and good security as the art of issuing, tracking, and reclaiming those keys with discipline.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.